Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Hope stings eternal. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, I have a story of identity theft.
Is this about other James Harrigan?
We should do an episode on other James Harrigan.
For those of you who don't join me on the Facebook, there are a number of other James Harrigans who just can't get their own email addresses straight. The latest is another James Harrigan who joined Match.com, and I'm getting his emails. I'm getting his emails filled with pictures of women that he should find attractive, given whatever his algorithm is.
Meanwhile, he's wondering why he's getting no matches.
That's probably right. Meanwhile, I keep wondering how long it's going to be before my wife drifts behind me as I'm working on my computer and wonders what the hell these emails filled with pictures of women are all about. You have an identity theft that is not James Harrigan.
No, my story is one of identity theft, and this happened to a friend of a friend. The way it came to light is that the woman stopped getting mail, and she figured that she just lucked out and somehow ended up off of the various junk mail lists, but her mail kind of dried up, and she didn't think too much about it until her sister sent her a package and didn't hear back and called her up and said, well, what about that package I sent you? And the woman says, I don't know anything about a package. And that's where the whole thing comes to light, that someone had stolen her address. The scary thing about this is, apparently, it is incredibly easy to do. If you go to the post office or you do this online, you've got to verify your identity. And I don't know how they do that online, but if you go in person, you've got to show an ID. And if you verify your identity, then you can forward your mail to some other address. The loophole in all of this is that the post office will also allow you to forward your mail by filling out a card and putting it in your mailbox. And it says on the card, as you sign it, under penalty of law, you are the person who owns this address. Of course, I don't think anyone who's interested in stealing mail is going to be too put off by that. But that's exactly what happened. Someone signed the card saying, forward the mail to this address, put it in the post office box, and lo and behold, the mail was forwarded. Now, that creates a cascading problem because things like your Social Security card, if you want a replacement, they'll mail it to your address, the one that's on file. Now, all of a sudden, that's being forwarded to somebody else. So too the replacement PIN for your bank card. You call up the bank and say, I lost the card or I lost the PIN or whatever it is. Send me a new one. They send it to the address on file, and it then gets forwarded to whoever the bad guy is. I was astounded that this could happen. I thought certainly there's something going on at our local post office that they're dropping the ball on this. So I did a little bit of research, and it turns out, no, this is a thing. The post office has long been aware of this and done nothing about it.
As much as I love the post office, that sounds in character, doesn't it?
Can you imagine a private company that had control over our identity in some fashion like this, letting the ball drop like this? There'd be congressional hearings. There'd be class action lawsuits. But it's a post office. We all just smile and say, well, what can you do? It's like your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving. That's just who it is, right?
That's right. We all shrug our shoulders and say, well, it's the post office.
I ran across this story, and coincidentally, one of our listeners, Don Ram, sent me an email about a similar story. He said that California recently started handing out money to people ostensibly to make up for the rising price of gas. It was to alleviate the pain from the rising price of gas. And there's a whole other story that falls under this heading, which is apparently California did not determine who gets the money based on how much you drive or how much gas you buy. They based it on your income. So the more income you get, the more of this money that you get. What does California do? They send you can have it direct deposited if you want, but if you don't have it direct deposited, they will send to your mailbox a card, a debit card that you can just use as cash. There's no security on this thing. And these cards run from, depending on who's receiving them, anywhere from $250 to $1,000 is on this card.
Oh, I'm bringing a crowbar down to those mailboxes at the apartment complex.
And that's exactly what Don was complaining about. He said about 10 of the cluster mailboxes in our neighborhood were broken into in February.
Well, hell yeah. That could have been 10 grand worth of debit
Exactly.
cards.
But all of this just falls under the heading of the post office and people who use the post office not thinking about what it is that they're doing. And it's the government, so we just smile and shrug and say, well, they'll try harder next time.
It's the post office. I'm sure they didn't mean it. Tesla, those nice people that make those ridiculous cars, shockingly have cut prices yet again, this time of Models X and S, in an attempt to what? Boost demand. Apparently, demand is flagging. Elon Musk's nonsense with Twitter probably not helping matters any. But you might recall that not too long ago, they dropped the price on the entry-line models, and the owners lost their minds. They got all agitated because why should new people get a discount when I didn't? I get that you might be frustrated that you picked the wrong time to buy an expensive car, but this is how it works, right? Sometimes rebates happen and dealers sell cars for less than you paid, and you just have to deal with that. The upshot is that Tesla is reducing the price of the cars now, I think, functionally across the board over all their models. Good thing, bad thing? I don't know. I think they were overpriced to begin with, and when you used to be able to manipulate the government money to get your kickback for the electric vehicle, the math gets kind of complicated when asking the basic question, should I buy this car? So let's get a look at the stock price. Over the past year, Tesla is down almost 32%.
Coincidentally, I pulled the past years of data on Tesla stock. I'm going to be using it as an example in my stats class tomorrow. It kind of straight lines down.
The 5-year return is plus 760%.
Sure, if you start out at $10 a share, whatever it is, yeah. But I think all of that was realized in that first 6 months or 1 year.
It peaks at 2022. But look, the stock price has been tanking, and it's been tanking for a while. Tesla's going to have to do something to boost demand, and unless they make a better product, they're going to have to make it cheaper. I just don't see a lot of other options. I think they've probably got a real problem. This, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week, and I'm going to talk about guns in the, I would say, great state of New York, but that's not right, in the People's Republic of New York, where you could never really carry a weapon, and you can't even own them, actually. When I moved to New York, I called the police department and said, look, I own some weapons. I just moved into the state. What do I need to do to get legal? And they said, oh, yeah, well, the first thing you need to do is bring your guns down to the police station and turn them in.
Right. So much for the Second Amendment.
Welcome to New York, where the Second Amendment apparently doesn't apply in the least, and where, incidentally, I decided that I would just keep my guns and break whatever laws they had. The idea that you would take something like weapons that you own and you would just go down and turn them in at a police station is baffling to me. The woman continued, and she said, after you've lived here for a year, then, and notice the language of privilege that she's using here, then you can go before a judge and explain why you think you need your guns back.
Right.
And the judge will decide whether you can have them or not. And I can guarantee you that not is the correct answer in every single case. It was so bad, as a matter of fact, that when I lived there, if you went to a gun show, you weren't allowed to handle a pistol unless you had a license, because it's not for sale to you. Because who gets a license? Retired police officers.
Right.
And that's about it. So there's a new problem in New York. We've got a couple of Supreme Court cases that have changed the landscape on sidearms and what's going to be legal. In a case called Bruin, I'll put a link in the show notes for you to an article, a very even-handed, well-written article from Reason Magazine, a very even-handed, well-written magazine, generally speaking. The court held that the right to keep and bear arms, guaranteed by the Second Amendment, precludes states from requiring that residents, quote, demonstrate a special need for self-protection distinguishable from that of the general community before they are allowed to carry handguns outside their homes. So this idea that you have to prove that you need one is ridiculous. It's a constitutionally protected right. You don't have to prove a thing. You have to do whatever you want. That's what constitutional rights are. They're utter protections for you against the government, right? Because who's going to come for you? Well, it's not your neighbor, it's the government. New York has decided that the clear language of Supreme Court rulings notwithstanding, they're not going to bother.
They're just going to ignore the Supreme Court.
Because what are they doing instead? They've declared that there are sensitive places and you can't have a gun in a sensitive place.
I bet the sensitive place is New York State.
Essentially, yes, but they don't manage to explain exactly where the sensitive areas are, so you literally can't know. And when you get to a sensitive place, if you find out and you say, oh, okay, well, I'll leave my firearm in my glove box in the car and lock the car. No. That's a felony too.
So let me get this straight. So New York State is saying, okay, you can carry a gun except in specially identified places, and we're not going to tell you where those places are. And if we catch you with your gun in that place, you've committed a felony. That's astounding. I mean, you got to give them credit for the creativity here.
It's just astonishing, right? Because we've seen this for years, where various places just decide that the Second Amendment's not going to apply there. And the Supreme Court has done exactly nothing to address this for decades. And finally, we get a court that looks at the plain language of the amendment and says, this is ridiculous, and we all know it, and you all know it, so just cut it out. And the states, rather than saying, yeah, okay, I guess we better cut it out, up the ante by making things even more ridiculous. And this is going to end in New York with star chambers deciding who's guilty and who's not. Hint, everybody's guilty.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. If you're a full-time college student looking for something educational, fun, and free, apply to join me and James and several faculty who have appeared on Words and Numbers at the inaugural summer seminar on the theory and practice of classical liberalism. The week-long seminar is hosted by the Stevenson Institute at Wabash University and will be held June 5th through the 10th. There's no charge, and meals and lodging are provided. To apply, see the link in the show notes. Phil Magness is Director of Research and Education at the American Institute for Economic Research and a Research Fellow at the Independent Institute. Phil's research specialties include the economic history of the United States, the economic dimensions of slavery and racial discrimination, and the histories of taxation and economic inequality. In addition to prodigious research output, he has written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Newsweek, Politico, Reason, and National Review. This is the second of a two-part episode.
I hear you've been watching some television.
It's called the 1619 Project, and it is a new series on Hulu that's the latest iteration of the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning journalistic venture into the history of slavery. It's not about history that they're pursuing here. This is all about a political message, and therefore historical fact, when it is challenged or when they are saying information that's just outright wrong, they don't really care. That's not the point here. The purpose is to tell a narrative, and that narrative is to support a very progressive left-wing political agenda that's suitable for the year 2023 rather than any retrospective assessment of the past.
Here we are in 2023, and I can say that race relations in the United States are infinitely better now than they have ever been.
Yeah.
That is just simply true.
I see that just by how my students interact with each other.
I see it in the composition of my neighborhood and how people shop together at the grocery store. Race relations are at this moment better than they have ever been. And they get a little better year in and year out.
Yeah.
We're looking at something that's actually improved to the point where I would call it good, and that it keeps right on getting better. So my question, Phil, is this: why, against this backdrop, is this exactly when the criticism and the claims against become so much more shrill? Why is it that we're angrier now than we've ever been when things now are better than they've ever been?
Well, I think there's two sides to this. One of them, there's a disconnect between tangible empirical evidence, which, we deal in numbers, we deal in data. Tangible empirical evidence not only shows that our race relation is better, but at this point in history, African Americans and other minority groups are more economically empowered than basically any time prior to that. The economic conditions have improved vastly over previous generations and generations before them. There's a disconnect between that hard empirical data and the political rhetoric around it. So that's one component of it. The second thing falls into a category is what some economists refer to as the rent-seeking narrative. And the rent-seeking narrative is basically using political rhetoric, using moralistic claims in some cases, using arguments that are suited for the ballot box to try to gain access to resources. basically try to guilt people into giving you money or adopting a political position that you seek and you desire. And we find this in all number of issues. It just happens that race is one where rent seeking can be very lucrative in this sense. So this is where I see Nicole Hannah-Jones going to a library and saying, hey, if I come here, I'll speak for an hour for $40,000, and therefore you get to wear the badge that you've done something, you've virtue signaled racial justice.
I've voted.
You get to take credit for
It's
that.
the I've voted sticker all over again.
Exactly.
Except it's really expensive. Some people, like me, might even refer to it as a fleecing.
Yes.
You're being fleeced if you pay this kind of money for this kind of product.
Especially something that's this deficient in its intellectual merits, this deficient in its academic quality.
Right. And if you're that concerned about getting this message, well, go watch the thing on Hulu.
Yeah, well, and you find that the Hulu series has a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign against it.
Imagine that.
We don't know the viewer numbers yet, but the early signs were that almost nobody was watching it, but elite media, elite journalism, academia was all in love with it. So it's another classic.
Phil, I do hereby predict that you will never know the viewership numbers.
That is probably the case.
You know, Hulu, if pushed into a corner, would say something like it's a prestige offering.
Yes.
We did it because the greater good demanded it. They would give you answers like this.
Right.
Yeah, but you know it's going to be assigned in college courses across the country.
And they're pushing for that. There's a K through 12 curriculum that lines up with the Hulu series. They want classroom adoption in colleges. There's a major push to this. It's a multi-million-dollar campaign. What's really troubling of this is not only just the academic deficiencies of what's being taught in there, some of the episodes go into true crackpot land. Marxist theorists that are pushing conceptualizations of racial capitalism that define capitalism as inherently exploitative. Their grievance with slavery is not so much that slavery is this moral abomination, which it absolutely is. Their main grievance with slavery is that it disrupted the working class proletarian consciousness by dividing black from white, and that prevents the socialist revolution from ever happening.
Said a group of people working on a project designed to make them money.
Let's go back to the original in the New York Times. One of the first things I fact-checked them on and tried to get a correction on, Matthew Desmond writes this essay. He claims that Microsoft Excel spreadsheets are directly descended from the plantation accounting books.
What?
Yeah. You're reading this and you just kind of a head scratcher. Did he just say that?
Given how long it takes me to work on a spreadsheet, maybe.
Well, yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, but Microsoft is not the friendliest user product. But he makes this claim. And first off, I investigated because I'm one of these people. I'm weird in the sense I read footnotes. And it turns out he misread the book that he was quoting. The book says, I'm not claiming plantation accounting books are the direct precursors to Microsoft Excel, and he just transposed the words. So that's why I tried to get a correction. Of course, the editor of the New York Times series says back to me, this is just an interpretive difference. But they've abandoned that claim in the Hulu series. Now it's Amazon.com warehouses are the direct descendants of the slave plantations. So they juxtapose in the video old pictures of slaves working in the cotton fields, and they shift to the modern Amazon warehouse of workers on the floor. And, very heavy overtones in the way it's presented. It's almost propagandistic.
Do they not realize that both white and black people work there and that those people get paid?
But there's the thing, because the white and black laborers are divided by racial capitalism, which prevents them from having class consciousness and coming together. And the apotheosis of the episode is a failed union vote at one of these Amazon.com warehouses. And the fact that the union did not become obvious and adopted at 90% of the workers supporting it is proof that the proletarian classes have been divided by race. This is the level of nonsense that comes out. She gets this theory from a UCLA professor by the name of Robin Kelly. You find out that this guy is just like a hardcore fringe heterodox Marxist who has been touting this racial capitalism narrative for decades. He's one of these people that comes out of a very obscure radical intellectual tradition. He looks back at the civil rights movement. His most famous academic book, which I looked up and read through some of the thesis of it, is the civil rights movement is not the product of the NAACP and what we would consider liberal and classical liberal arguments in favor of anti-discrimination, anti-prejudice, equal treatment under the law, which was the argument that won the day in the civil rights movement. He's saying the real driver here are the radicals. It's the Communist Party that's the only friend of African Americans in the 1930s and 40s. It's an alternative revisionist history of the civil rights movement, and he carries that forward today, but it's all shoehorned into this class consciousness narrative.
Phil, there were about 13 people in the Communist Party in the 1930s in the
Yes.
United States.
Yes.
I mean, I can't think of a single mainstream historian who thinks that we had an active or vibrant communist tradition in the United States.
But then they go back to the circularity. It's because slavery disrupted class consciousness, and therefore a true socialist communist movement could not emerge.
Every single thing they end up saying is non-falsifiable.
Exactly. It's circular. It's dependent on the acceptance of these nonsensical definitions that predefine capitalism as exploitative and therefore in need of toppling.
So really what we end up seeing, and correct me if you don't think I'm being fair here, is assertion after assertion without correct evidence, and it comes to be the case that the assertion is all that matters.
Yes.
If you assert it loudly and repeatedly.
Yes. You know, overlayer on this, what they do in the episode, actually between a couple different episodes, so they blame capitalism. Capitalism is the source of all evil in the world and needs to be overturned because racial capitalism means exploitation is inherent to the market process. But then when it comes time in the episode to present evidence of discriminatory institutions from the past and present, what do? They read through a list of all the ways that the federal government has screwed over Black people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So they go to the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s when it adopts redlining practices to keep Black people from getting loans. They talk about when the federal highway system comes through, they use eminent domain to bulldoze the poor neighborhoods where African Americans live. One of the episodes opens with this really kind of heart-wrenching story about African Americans in the 1940s in this community coast of Georgia. The military moved in and said, we want your land to build a military base for World War II. After the war, it's basically of no use, and they won't let the Black residents come back. They underpay them through eminent domain, give them well below the land value of the area. And then a few years later, they turn it over to the environmentalists to make an environmental refuge, a wildlife refuge out of it. So it's completely mistreating and abusing people by stealing their land. They're telling this whole story, and then it's like, and that's because of capitalism. The narrative doesn't even make sense on these most basic things because they are getting into some real racial injustices that were perpetrated in the past and have legacies all the way up in the present day. Because there are people still alive that were displaced from this land in Georgia, people still alive that are victims of redlining, victims of abuses that we have in our prison system. All of this runs through with economic effects in the present day. And yet each and every example comes from something the government did.
Yeah, every one of these examples is something a free market economist would point to and say, yes, you're absolutely right. None of this should have happened.
Even back to the labor union. They love labor unions. Labor unions are the inherent good that the proletarian classes are supposed to adopt with 90%, or else it's proof of racism. And yet they acknowledge elsewhere in the series the Wagner Act of 1935. This is the federal government stepping in and declaring that labor unions have legally protected power to strike, to organize, to basically give them a privileged position in a court of law and under the regulatory regime. One of the major problems of the Wagner Act is most labor unions in that era were segregated. They kept out African American members. So by strengthening the labor unions, it allowed entire industries to shut out Black workers because they didn't want the competition. Black worker wage competition lowers the wages that they can pay to white workers. And the whole purpose of the union is to cartelize the white workforce at the expense of the Black workforce. So this is hinted at and acknowledged in the series. And yet there's this logical leap that makes no sense where they go from that to the fact that an Amazon.com warehouse doesn't unionize the way they want. And that's proof of racism.
All right, so I guess the ultimate question here is how on earth do they manage to conflate capitalism and government so completely?
Yeah.
How is it that they blame capitalism, and by the time they get to list the grievances, not a single one is from capitalism properly understood?
It is surreal listening to some of these arguments, and I've gone through every episode with a fine-tooth comb, basically so the rest of you don't have to in some ways, but the inconsistencies, the leaps of logic, I mean, it doesn't even pass the basic smell test. So I hope that this is the silver lining when they're shoving this thing into the classroom. Any reasonably intelligent student will watch this and walk away scratching their head about the narrative, not thinking that it's something that's been conveyed as truthful, but rather, why is this episode inconsistent with the previous episode?
But those same students who are shaking their heads won't dare speak out loud.
No, because you get ostracized if you engage in wrongthink here.
We're not allowed to criticize. And Hannah Nicole Jones, with her knee-jerk reaction every time somebody brings, dare I say it, a fact to her attention, she loses her mind and becomes an insult machine.
Yes.
And anybody who disagrees is definitionally either a racist on the one hand or an Uncle Tom on the other.
It's vilification of anyone that speaks out against it. And I think this is what you see in the academy, why most historians would look at this. If they're a scholar worth their merit, if they have any sense of appreciation for their field, they look at this and they see it as defective, flawed historical analysis. Yet, what happened? Well, over the summer, the president of the American Historical Association, James Sweet, writes a very mild criticism of the 1619 Project in the association's newsletter. And this came out about July or August. He was basically denouncing politicization of history. He says the right does it, the left does it, everyone in between does it, and it discredits the field. And he cited the 1619 Project as a leftward politicization of history. Well, half of the profession lost their mind. The journalist class lost their mind. Within hours of this going live, there are petitions all over Twitter calling for his resignation. There are posted lists of the entire board of the organization and calls for cancellation campaigns to bombard them with emails urging that this guy be fired. Within 48 hours, he does like a Marxian struggle session style apology for the fact that he used the wrong tone in criticizing the 1619 Project. Completely lost in this discussion is the fact that his criticisms had merits in evidence, had merits in factuality. That's just completely shoved aside.
As is made perfectly clear by what happened to him at their hands.
Yes.
This could have been in a Monty Python movie.
Yes. It's burn the witch style mentality. And you think about this, if the head of the American Historical Association, if leading historians like Gordon Wood and James McPherson, if people that are recognized experts in their field are being vilified, these are people that generally have tenure and secure careers and a presence at the top of their profession. What does that mean to the untenured junior professor that's teaching 4 history classes just trying to make it by? They would never dare stick their neck out.
You have a career that's just starting. You likely have a mortgage, a family of some kind, a car payment. You don't dare come out and speak what every rational person knows to be the obvious and plain truth of the matter.
And if you do, Nicole Hannah-Jones will be there sicking her 600,000 Twitter followers on you and on your administration calling for your job.
Or at your local library making things even worse.
Yes.
You know, it's strange. When people think about the United States, particularly the United States prior to 1860s, we think of it as synonymous with slavery. And that's strange, because slavery wasn't unique to the United States. In fact, it's been around as long as human societies have been around. If anything, we should look at it in the reverse. The United States was the first government to put in print, if not in fact, the statement that all people are created equal. And then within whatever it was, 80 years, went on to fight the bloodiest war in our history to make those words true. And then went on and spent the next century translating those truths into society through law and then ultimately the Civil Rights Act. To the extent that you look around today and you see not only no slavery, but not even a hint of it. All of this reversing within a few generations, a practice that dates back to the dawn of humanity.
Well, they want to write that component out of our history. And you see this immediately after the Declaration of Independence makes that famous claim that all men are created equal. There are most of the northern colonies that eventually become states in the course of the Revolution go through the motions of abolishing slavery on a basis that it is philosophically and legally and morally inconsistent with this act they have just undertaken. So the revolution in many ways jumpstarts the abolition movement. Abolitionism, you find, is almost entirely written out of the equation by the 1619 Project narrative. It doesn't really give a coherent answer of where the end of slavery comes from, because, even someone like Frederick Douglass, I think, was mentioned all of once in the original New York Times print version, and they got a huge criticism of this. It's like, wait a minute, you're making all these claims, but where's Frederick Douglass in the story? Well, it turns out Frederick Douglass's theory of constitutionalism views the Constitution as a document that can be used and weaponized against slavery, views the Declaration of Independence as a liberty doctrine. That is inconsistent with the story of the 1619 Project. So they've since kind of come back and backfilled him in really ham-fisted ways to make him fit into the narrative, but that was all response to criticism. But you don't have room for abolitionism. You don't have room for a philosophical reckoning with the wrong and evil of slavery anywhere in this narrative. It's just all pushed aside because their objective is to basically take Roger B. Taney's version of the Constitution and assert that this is the only way to look at the Constitution. This is how it always was. It sanctioned slavery, it sanctioned racial inequality, and did so in a way that's irredeemable.
Well, that's not exactly true, though, is it? It can be redeemed for $13 trillion.
Well, there's the price tag. Yeah.
13 trillion, and it'll all go away somehow.
So half the GDP of the United States, and no plan to pay for it either. She's asked that question at one point in the documentary series, and she poses it to one of her experts. She says, well, can we achieve this? How do we pay for it? The answer they come up with was, we don't need to tax anybody. We can just, basically, they say, we're going to print the money. It's modern monetary theory.
Oh, my God.
And Antony, I can tell by the tone of your laugh that it's time to say we're all out of time on Words and Numbers. And we're going to have to cover the MMT angle of the Hannah Nicole Jones nonsense someday down the road.
I'm just picturing modern monetary theory weaponized by the 1619 Project.
We all knew it would happen. We just didn't know what would pull the trigger. Phil, thank you so much for coming by. I'm feeling a little more agitated now than when we started.
Phil, thank you. This has been great.
Absolutely.
We're already looking forward to next time when you'll explain how MMT solves all the world's problems.